So good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start momentarily. Great. Okay, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to NASB's learning session, State Policy to Support Early Literacy Success. My name is Winona Howe, and I am the Director of Early Learning at NASB. We're so excited to host this event because early literacy is such an important topic on state boards' mind. We observed more and more state boards and also states pass legislation and policies to advance early literacy outcomes in the past couple of years. Next slide, please. Okay, so a few logistics. First of all, please say hello in the chat with your name, state, and affiliation. And this webinar will be recorded, and we will send a slide deck to you after the webinar. And there's a closed captioning function that you can turn it on at any time. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions, and look to the chat box for resource links and the speaker's bios. And then I want to talk about a format. This is a learning session, which includes two parts. The first 60 minutes will be a webinar format that is open to all audience. The last 30 minutes will be a member-only session. So if you're not a NASB member, please log off your Zoom. All NASB members and speakers, please stay on. We will transition you to a member-only session. So next slide, please. Okay, so today's agenda, as you can see, we have a jam-packed agenda. You will first hear from me talking about early literacy work group at a very high level. Then we will have the Future Ed present their newest research featuring the 50-state scan. And after Future Ed, you will hear from National Council on Teacher Quality. They will present their research on teacher prep programs. And last but not least, you will hear from Colorado about their educator prep programs reauthorization process. And after that, we will have our NASB's CEO and President, Paulo Di Maria, to moderate a discussion. And again, please send in your question in the Q&A box at any time. Next slide, please. So I would love to briefly talk about NASB's early literacy work before we introduce the first speaker. So in our 2021 and 2022 annual member surveys, early literacy was ranked top priority by our members. We responded to our members' needs and really quickly. In May 2022, we established the NASB Early Literacy Work Group. So there are 16 state board members from 14 states and territories apply to join the inaugural work group. As you can see, those states and territories are listed on the screen. And in the first year, we hosted 4 work group meetings, including 1 in-person meeting and a school visit. As you can see, everybody's very happy on the picture. We visited the Wildflower Accelerated Academy in Arizona. And next slide, please. So after the first 3 meetings, the work group actually came out with 7 policy areas they want to focus on. They are supports for educators, stakeholder communications, instruction and curriculum, assessment and screening, retention and intervention, evaluation for programs and educators, license and certification. So in summer, NASB really delved into 2 areas, and we published 2 policy briefs. One is teachers need multifaceted support to improve literacy. The other one is a state innovation piece, Georgia and Massachusetts advanced dyslexia screening and intervention. So I highly recommend you to go to our website to read these policy briefs. Next slide, please. Okay, so I forgot to mention something. Like looking forward, we really hope to expand our work group. And we want to provide more opportunity for our members to improve their knowledge around literacy and learn from each other. And also we want to inform policymakers with the most recent research and practices when they develop their policies. We're planning another meeting actually in October in San Diego. If state board member on this call is interested in learning more, please let me know. Okay, so that's all from me. Now I'm gonna talk about today's speakers. As you can see, our first speaker is Bella DiMarco, who is the policy analyst from Future Ed. For the sake of time, we're not gonna read her bio, but please look for her bio in the chat. Bella, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Winona, and thank you to NASB for hosting this webinar today and for inviting us to speak. So in early June, Future Ed released a report on early literacy and sort of specifically on the implementation of states' literacy policies because, as we know, passing legislation is really just sort of the first step in all of this. And so we documented in our report the efforts of states like Mississippi and Tennessee that have translated their state level policies into effective classroom practices. And what we came up with was sort of a set of recommendations that can serve sort of as a blueprint for implementation for other states as they implement their literacy policies. And so before I sort of dive into like what we found in that report, I do think it's important to note that implementation is not a one size fits all model. There are sort of several key components that should be universal across states. But again, like what that looks like within each state will be different, and that's okay. And so the first thing to sort of note is that in order to really sort of change instruction and shift student outcomes, states need to take sort of a comprehensive state level approach to all of this. So just training teachers or just providing curriculum is not going to be enough to really move the needle. States really need to develop cohesive sort of multi-year plans that include multiple levers that are sort of intentionally thought out over multiple years. And so with this, one of the sort of core and important components is making sure to build capacity. So the State Department of Eds need to have the capacity to be able to implement these policy requirements. They need to have the capacity to collect data, and track the implementation of these new initiatives. And so this capacity is both sort of internal capacity, but then also thinking about sort of contracting in the areas where maybe that internal capacity is lacking. And so just one example, Mississippi is one state that has sort of dedicated an entire literacy division to support their state's sort of literacy work and implementation of their policy. And so another sort of key component of this literacy work is the importance of training teachers and specifically making sure that the training is aligned to the core curriculum that is used in the classroom. And so this is going to look different across different states, but the important thing is that it's a statewide effort. And so some states like Tennessee, they've created their own sort of professional development programs. So Tennessee, for example, they contracted with TNTP to create sort of their training courses that all teachers within the state will go through. Other states are using the LETRS training, which is the program that Mississippi used and saw a lot of success with. And then other states are sort of putting out approved vendor lists that districts can contract with to provide training for teachers within their district. And some states are doing sort of a combination of all of these or providing multiple development opportunities for their teachers. And then in addition to sort of that initial statewide training, teachers need ongoing support. And so a lot of states are using sort of literacy coaches or reading specialists in this capacity. And so this was one of sort of the core components of Mississippi's work was they had these state trained reading coaches that were doing what they were calling sort of literacy learning walks, where they were observing classrooms and sort of providing this ongoing ongoing sort of support for their teachers and areas for improvement. And other states like Virginia and Tennessee are sort of similarly using reading coaches, reading specialists, and things like that. One additional thing that Tennessee has done is they have created these district implementation networks for districts to be able to collaborate with one another, to be able to share best practices, areas of improvement across districts, and things like that. So the next sort of key component in this work is making sure that all students and all teachers have access to high quality instructional materials that are grounded in the science of reading. And so this is really important because, you know, you can train your teachers all you want, but if they go back to the classroom and they don't have the right materials or they don't have the right tools to be successful, then this is not going to be as effective. And so it's really important that states ensure that districts are using the right materials in the classroom. And so ideally, a state would provide sort of a vetted list or a list of approved curriculum that districts can choose from, whether this is a required list or a recommended list. State should put out some sort of list that districts can choose to make sure that districts are using curriculum in the classroom that sort of meets those requirements. And so some states are incentivizing districts to choose materials that do align with the evidence. So New Mexico, for example, just this past year, they created a reading materials fund for districts to purchase materials that align with the evidence base. And then other states are taking sort of more aggressive approaches to making sure that districts are using the right materials in the classroom. So Arkansas, for example, they are one of the states that has explicitly banned the use of 3Qing in the classroom. And so for those who might not be familiar, 3Qing is one of the really harmful components of balanced literacy programs or of whole language programs that basically encourages kids to guess the word rather than sound it out and actually learn how to read it. And so starting this school year, districts in Arkansas can lose 10% of their state funding if they don't comply with this ban, and charter schools can lose their authorization or their reauthorization. And then another component is being sure to actually be able to monitor implementation. And we know that like test scores, it can take several years to be able to see results sort of reflected in the test scores. And so it's really important that states are measuring progress in other ways. And so just for example, Mississippi and Tennessee, there are two states that have created sort of observational tools that districts can use. So things like classroom walkthroughs, instructional rubrics, and tools like that districts can use to sort of see how teachers are implementing these new reading strategies in the classroom. And with this, I think it's important to note that these tools that districts are using are for, they're to help identify areas for additional support and areas of improvement, and they're not for evaluation purposes. The next sort of key component is universal screening. And so states need to make sure that districts are screening all K-3 students at least 3 times per year using a high quality screening tool to identify, you know, the risk for dyslexia or other sort of reading difficulties. And again, the state approach will vary, but ideally states would select sort of a single state approved screening tool that all districts within the state would use. That said, if a single tool does not work within the context of that state, states can also approve a list of screening tools that districts can choose from. So in Tennessee, for example, the state, they tried to adopt initially a single screening tool, but they received pushback from that. And so they ended up putting out a list of tools that districts could choose from, but they made one tool free of charge for all districts to sort of incentivize districts to adopt a single tool within the state. And I believe that about 90% of districts in the state of Tennessee do use that free tool. Colorado is another example of a state that has put out a approved list of screening tools, and they're actually one of the few that has approved both English and Spanish screening tools, which is really important when you consider our ELL population and being able to determine if a student has like a reading deficiency or if they're just presenting sort of a normal language barrier. And also sort of having this information about the students' literacy level in their home language can also help inform instruction and interventions if needed. And so if a student is identified with a reading deficiency, parents need to be notified right away, and the student needs to be provided with interventions. And these interventions can take various forms, but the important thing is that they need to be aligned to the core curriculum. And so some states, like Louisiana, for example, they require students to be given individual reading plans within sort of a certain time frame after that initial identification. So in Louisiana, I believe it's within 30 days after they're identified with a reading deficiency, they need to be presented with a plan on how to sort of catch students up and help students succeed. And so some states will also require sort of parental involvement in developing these reading plans, which you can imagine is important when you consider that sometimes the interventions could be like summer or weekend reading camps, before school or after school activities, or sort of at home reading activities as well. The parents sort of need to be on board with what the school is proposing to provide for their student. And then sort of a related issue is the issue of third grade retention. And this is really sort of the last resort when we talk about interventions. And really the focus should be on preventing students from needing to be retained in the first place, rather than actually focusing on this retention piece. But that said, if it is determined that a student needs to be retained, that student needs to be provided with individualized support, evidence-based support, and something that is different than what they had been receiving for the past couple of years. And just another thing on the retention piece, some states do require students be retained in the third grade if they aren't sort of reading at grade level. And I think it's really important to note that determining whether or not a student should be retained should never be just based on test scores or just based on one metric alone. It really should be sort of a comprehensive look at how that student is doing and what that student needs to be successful. And then another sort of big component that we're going to hear a lot more about later is teacher preparation. And this is arguably sort of the first step in all of this. And so basically states need to ensure that all teacher candidates that are going through a teacher prep program in their state leave that prep program and are able to demonstrate an understanding of science of reading. They know how to teach reading effectively, and they know how to use and select high quality instructional materials. And so states should use their authority to push programs to revise their standards and to sort of align their curriculum with the science of reading. So Tennessee is just one sort of example of a state that has done this. And so their state board approved revised standards for their prep programs. And so under this new system, state officials can basically deny approval for a prep program if they don't adopt these, the revised standards. And so Colorado, who we're going to hear from later today, is also another good example of this. And then finally, and maybe obviously, but sustainability is really important. And so a lot of states have used like ESSER funds or other one-time funding sources for their literacy initiatives, which is a great way to sort of get these programs up and running, get these initiatives started. But in order to really be successful long term, states need to have dedicated funding to support their literacy work. And so Tennessee, for example, they used about $80 million of their COVID relief funds and another $40 million in other sort of federal grants to get their literacy work up and running. But now they have established permanent state funding to sustain these programs moving forward. Mississippi is another example. They appropriate about $15 million every year for their literacy work. And Virginia, in their state student funding formula, they just approved allocating one reading specialist for every 550 students. And so that is, those are sort of our key recommendations and our blueprint that we've developed for other states as they implement their literacy laws. And so with that, I can turn it over to NCTQ.
Thank you so much. Okay, give me 2 seconds. All right, can I get a thumbs up if that looks right? Thank you, Paolo. Okay, so thank you guys for joining us today. And thank you again to NASB for inviting us to speak. My name is Christy Ellis. I'm the Director of Special Programs from the National Council on Teacher Equality, and I'm going to be joined today by Shannon Holston, who's the Chief of Policy and Programs. Today, we're excited to share our findings from our recent report for the Teacher Prep Review, Reading Foundation Standard, which we recently released this past June. So the Reading Foundation Standard is grounded by the idea that all children deserve to learn to read and all teachers deserve the preparation that enables them to help their students achieve this goal. Giving students the knowledge and skills they need to effectively teach reading is fundamental for improving outcomes for all children and reversing historical patterns of inequity. Despite this, we know from NAEP data and other sources that far too many children aren't learning to read, and these rates of reading failure are rising and for historically marginalized students. The data is clear that this is a measure of systemic inequities and a lack of access to strong reading instruction, and it is not the fault of these students. Reading proficiency is starting to rebound after the pandemic, but we have a long way to go to not only reach pre-pandemic literacy rates, but to exceed them. So we know how to help more than 90% of students learn to read proficiently with scientifically based reading instruction, which means instruction on phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. However, research by NCTQ, as well as other organizations, has consistently found that teacher preparation programs aren't adequately preparing aspiring teachers in these 5 core components. To give a little bit of background on our work in this area, we first piloted the reading standard in 2006 and have comprehensively reviewed whether teacher preparation programs prepare elementary teachers to teach reading since 2013, using criteria designed in partnership with content experts that align with the science of reading. Over the last decade, NCTQ has seen programs improve, often when states implement policy outlining clear expectations for prep programs around the teaching of reading, offering support or capacity building, and holding programs accountable if they don't meet these expectations. Despite these pockets of improvement, there are still too many programs not devoting adequate attention to reading, and many are still teaching instructional practices that run contrary to the research. To reckon with this, NCTQ over the last 2 years have been updating our TPR reading standard based on input from the field. This revision wanted to keep pace with changes in the field, recognizing children's reading proficiency continues to fall short, and facilitating a transparent, inclusive, and rigorous process. This included 3 key components. The first was a convening of an expert advisory panel, including reading researchers, representatives from higher education, practitioners, and reading experts to help determine and guide the content of analysis. We also had a technical advisory group comprised of measurement experts to help guide our methodological changes. And we held a public comment period where we solicited feedback from the field on proposed updates to the standard, which was answered mostly actually by higher education faculty, but was also answered by district and state leaders, advocates, and also reading experts. So when we describe the standard, it does look for evidence of how programs prepare future teachers in the 5 components of scientifically based reading instruction: phonemic awareness, phonics fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. For each of these 5 components, we look at course materials for evidence from 4 instructional approaches: instructional hours, which includes the course time spent covering a topic; objective measures of knowledge, which can include tests, quizzes, exams, or graded written assignments; practice opportunities, which can include field experiences or experiences administering assessment. Essentially, any opportunity that a prospective teacher has acting in the role of a teacher is counted as a practice opportunity under our current standard. And lastly, we look at background materials, which can include textbooks, articles, or other resources. For each component, programs can earn up to 3 points per instructional approach for a total of 12 points possible, but they only need to earn 8 points to be considered adequate in any of the components. In addition, based on recommendations from our expert panel, we also created a second part of the standard, which integrates analysis on the extent to which programs are preparing candidates to teach 3 groups of students: English language learners, struggling readers, and students who speak language varieties other than mainstream English. We believe strongly that all educators should be prepared to teach a range of students with diverse needs in learning to read. So in the same way that we see how programs cover the 5 components, we also look at how the programs use those 4 instructional approaches to prepare candidates to teach a range of learners. So we look at their instructional time, objective measures of knowledge, background materials, and practice opportunities. This portion of the standard wasn't graded, but we are in the first phase of analysis, essentially, where we're able to collect data across the country and sort of benchmark programs where they are right now. And we did want to highlight a few of the key changes that we made based on the engagement and revision process. There were 3 key changes. The first is that we increased and differentiated expectations for the amount of instructional time programs devote to each of the 5 core components. So for example, we look for 8 hours for phonics and 4 hours for fluency. In addition, we review programs for the presence of reading practices contrary to the research. And lastly, we are now evaluating the requirement for candidates to practice instruction in a component where previously this was combined with where we looked for tests and other assignments. So I'm now going to start moving forward through some of our actual findings. If you are interested in this, you are free to look at the national findings page on our website, which can provide some additional information on all the data we're providing here today. So based on a review of the 4 instructional approaches, we found that around 25% of programs are fully addressing all 5 components of scientifically based reading instruction: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. More concerning is that about a quarter of programs aren't adequately addressing any of the components sufficiently. So we saw around 25% of the programs in our sample where we had, full information from them, syllabi from all of their courses, all the materials that we could look for. We saw around 25% of them aren't addressing any of the components. When we look at practices running contrary to the research, such as miscue analysis or 3Qing or running records, we are finding that around 40% of programs still teach more than one of these practices. So as seen here, the most commonly seen practices are guided reading and running records. But those practices that are, particularly problematic, like miscue analysis and 3Qing systems, are seen in about, 10 to 15% of programs. Teaching these practices can impede the learning of students, legitimizes ineffective methods, and can risk confusing aspiring teachers. So on our standard, programs earn a grade based on the number of components that they adequately cover. Programs earn an A by covering all 5 components, and programs can earn an A+ by having 10 points on average across all the components and no evidence of content contrary to research-based practices. You'll see here that, despite 25% of programs getting covering 5 or more components, only 23% of them earn an A. That's because programs teaching 4 or more contrary components can have their letter grade reduced by 1. So we found that there were only 23% of programs that earn an A, which does mean that 2% of them were moved down a letter grade because despite having great information on the components in their courses, they also are including 4 or more of those contrary practices. Despite those challenges, there are programs serving as great examples from which others can learn. Of the 173 programs that address all 5 components, 48 exemplary programs lead the way by not only exceeding the targets we set for all 5 components, but also by not teaching any methods contrary to the research. Of this, 8 were graduate programs. We have links on the national finding page, which Shannon linked in the chat, which provides syllabi from some of these programs who have already implemented great courses within their program, and we highly recommend that you use those resources if you're interested. Though all 5 components remain critical to developing strong readers, in the past decade of the Teacher Prep Review, we have consistently found that phonemic awareness is the least addressed component. This time, it is no different. 2 of 3 programs are not adequately addressing phonemic awareness. And when we look at where programs are typically falling short, most are not providing enough instructional hours or practice opportunities in this component. So when we want to look at some of the instructional practices, nearly 1/3 of programs aren't providing any practice opportunities connected to the core components of reading, despite widespread agreement among practitioners and researchers on the importance of practice. It seems intuitive. To get better, you need to practice. What we're often seeing is that programs might require candidates to practice teaching a reading lesson, but they're not setting any parameters around the content that should be taught in that lesson. So for example, instead of specifying that their practice lesson focuses on a phonics skill or a comprehension skill that they were taught during the class time, they may be asked instead to just follow the scope and sequence of whatever their mentor teacher is doing, and it may not directly relate to anything that they were taught within the reading course itself. So while programs often require practice opportunities within their courses, they are not being specific enough to actually be able to point them to the components. So as we briefly mentioned before, when we discussed adding the second part of the standard, it is of paramount importance that teachers are prepared to teach students with diverse needs, including English language learners, struggling readers, and speakers of English language varieties. It really doesn't matter where you're going to teach in America, you're going to have a classroom filled with diverse students with diverse needs. Despite this clear need, we are finding programs are currently providing very little preparation specific to the 3 populations we looked at. We've highlighted a little bit of the disparity here. So for example, 71% of programs aren't dedicating 2 instructional hours to English language learners, and 58% are not dedicating 2 hours for struggling readers. While speakers of English language varieties is a newer area of research and of awareness, at this point, we've only seen around 90% addressing this component at all. In our report, we wanted to make sure that we provide additional guidance and resources for programs. So we have some links to materials to learn more about these different groups, as well as resources that you can use within your classroom right now to ensure that you're providing diverse students with the experiences that they need to be able to read effectively. And I'm going to pass it to Shannon.
Thanks, Christy. So as noted earlier, with strong state policies on reading, effective implementation, and accountability, states can improve the quality of teacher preparation in reading. Several states have already taken this step, showing what is possible. Mississippi and Colorado stand out for their high scores for their teacher preparation programs and minimal existence of practices contrary to scientifically based reading instruction. And as Mary noted in the chat, this is something we see a lot of program in states that programs are teaching the science of reading, but they're also teaching unproven or lesser effective methods. Arkansas and Louisiana also showed strong performances in reading as well. And it's no surprise Mississippi and Colorado stand out given the investments and attention they have given over the years to promoting scientific-based reading instruction. And I think that's one thing I want to note, that this has been a focus for years in these states. And so we are seeing the results. I'll also note that in our last review in 2020, Colorado was at around the national average, and in just 3 years, they moved to the top of the list. So although it does take dedication and time, I think that we can also see results in a few years if given high accountability as well as high supports to our teacher preparation partners. I want to share a couple of resources to identify top programs in your state. If you go to the website that's on the screen there, you could just, it is filterable by state, so you can see who are the top programs in your state. I also put in the chat a link to state profiles. We created a short 3 to 4 page document for state specifically that'll give you, a nice snapshot of your state around all the programs in your area that have 5, or for all states that have 5 or more programs. And so as a state board member, what are some questions or some areas, understanding that each state board has differing authorities across the country? One is around specific, explicit, and comprehensive standards for teacher prep programs. So one question to ask is, do your current teacher preparation standards go beyond naming the 5 components of reading? I think we've illuminated around the notion that just naming the 5 components is not enough. There's a lot of gray area in there as far as what you may be expected to teach, the knowledge and skills around some of these practices that are not aligned with the science of reading, that are lesser effective methods. And so, do your preparation standards go beyond just naming the 5 components? Do you explicitly evaluate whether elementary teacher prep programs are aligned with scientifically based reading instruction? And do you have consequences if they are not? A lot of times what we see in terms of program renewal is 7 years, or they are deferred to as part of the accreditation process, which looks at the institution as a whole. And so it just may not get down in the nitty gritty in terms of only they're looking at their elementary teacher preparation program and its alignment with the science of reading. So a good question to ask yourself is like, what is our process for making sure that programs are aligning with our standards? Indiana and Ohio just recently passed some policy to dig into this in a much more specific way, and happy to talk offline or afterwards more in depth about what that could look like. And then lastly, ensure policy flexibility to promote continuous improvement. And Colorado might talk a little bit about this, but do you have the authority to compel alignment or some type of conditional renewal option through program renewal processes? We all want really high quality teachers in teaching our kids, and don't necessarily want to be in the business of shutting down programs either. So how do we make sure that programs align them to the standards that we need them to be? But like hold them accountable to make sure they're teaching our aspiring teachers the content that they need as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Colorado.
That's great. Thank you so much, Shannon. Hi, everyone. My name is Colleen O'Neill. I'm the Associate Commissioner of Educator Talent here at the Colorado Department of Education. Joining me and sharing our slides will be Mary Bivens, who is our Executive Director of Educator Talent. And so we're going to run through just a little bit about how Colorado established some of the work that we have to kind of really move our opportunities for teaching reading. And so the very first thing we'll talk about is our Colorado Educator Preparation Programs. And just a little context setting for us is that we have about 21 public and private colleges in Colorado. And I think context matters. I should probably preface it with context matters a little bit here as to how you're structured within your own individual state. So I'm going to give you that context, and then I'll talk about how we were able to move forward with some pretty strong information pieces and pretty strong legislation and collaboration. So in Colorado, we have those 21 public and private colleges and universities that offer our educator preparation programs. We also have 29 designated agencies that are considered alternative preparation programs. That could be anyone from our universities to our school districts or nonprofit organizations. And then we have 4 areas in which the teacher endorsement rules, or areas that we'll talk about when we talk about our rules for our rules and our statute in particular. We focused heavily on elementary, early childhood, special education, and early childhood special education. So let's talk just a little bit about our collaborations with our State Board of Education, our governor's office. Back in May 2016, we were able to create kind of the preparation standards with scientifically based reading standards in elementary, early childhood, and special education endorsement areas. That was the State Board of Education. So in Colorado, the state board is elected. We do not have a national, or we don't have a standards board, nor do we have a national accrediting agency. So Colorado is the accrediting agency. The Colorado State Board of Education, as well as the Department of Higher Education, is the accrediting body for all of our educator preparation programs. That's important to know because they had the authority and the autonomy and the opportunities to make sure that they had the rules and the statute in place to really drill down. I think Shannon talked a little bit about being explicit, not just saying it's the areas of scientifically based reading, but being explicit. So in May 2016, we were able to get the State Board of Education coalesced around being very clear as to what scientifically based reading standards were in our elementary, early childhood, and special education endorsement areas. Then in June 2018, the CDE strategic plan also coalesced around that. Not only did the strategic plan at the Colorado Department of Education get very clear about outlining a focus on early literacy and ensuring high quality preparation, but the State Board of Education then explicitly and very publicly directed CDE staff to ensure that all educator preparation programs and the reauthorizations included a focus on early reading instruction. At the same time that was happening, the governor's office was also saying the exact same thing. We want you to coalesce around this, and we want you to go forward and make sure that our educator preparation programs are teaching our teachers how to teach children to read using a scientifically based, evidence-driven process. And so to that end, in 2019, we had what was called the READ Act implementation, which reinforced it one more time in state statute through our legislature. And then again in 2019 under Senate Bill 190, they went forward and not only said, do we expect this to happen in our schools, we also expect it to happen in our teacher preparation programs, and got very clear that every educator preparation program had to require coursework that aligned to the 5 components of the science of reading. And then we were able to dig into a matrix and understanding what that meant as we brought those things together. So then we fast forward just a little bit to 2020, and we had Senate Bill 158 that was around professional training for educators, specifying a specific focus for our teacher preparation programs around reading courses and field-based practices. I think one of our team members previously talked a little bit about, are you practicing this before you enter the classroom as well? So we drilled down very, very tightly into all of those arenas. With that, short little presentation around where we came from, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Bivens to talk about our educator preparation refocus and our authorization process and how we got our ed prep programs to coalesce around this in about 3 years.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Thanks for everybody's time today. We're going to be going through these quickly, but I know you're going to get the slides, so happy to take deeper questions whenever you would like them. One key thing is, besides the alignment that Colleen talked about that was so critical between our legislature, our state board, the State Department, all of our standards, students, preparation standards. I think one of the keys is also to know that in Colorado, the State Department and the Department of Education and the State Board of Education have the sole authority to authorize and reauthorize preparation programs. Your state may have a standards board. Colorado doesn't. Your state may work with more than one department. So I think it's important to understand who has the authority and accountability and oversight over preparation programs. But in Colorado, it landed with the state board. So that's one important thing. As Colleen mentioned, in our timeline, we held our very first, what we like to refer to as a deep dive into reading instruction. Shannon talked about this. When you're going to reauthorize a preparation program, it's usually at a pretty high level, even when you're looking at content and syllabi. Well, we took it and really dove deep into reading instruction. And I'm purposely saying reading instruction, not literacy, because we were talking about those emergent reading strategies around scientifically based reading. We started our first deep dive in November of 2018 with our largest university, who prepares most of our educators in Colorado. And that university, we had to put on conditional reauthorization. So immediately we created quite a stir in the state around not reauthorizing and granting full reauthorization to our largest university provider. This is just a chart to see what the first couple years looked like. How many of our programs were we looking into? How many, again, elementary, early childhood, or special ed endorsement areas they have that we were really doing this deep dive in. In those first 2 years, 5 of our university programs were put on a conditional reauthorization, giving them just 1 year with very explicit areas for improvement to address their scientifically based reading instruction for their candidates, to then come back in front of the state board after another site visit and review of their content and talking to their candidates to really ensure that those shifts had been made. We also had 2 alternative programs that were not prepared to meet the reading standards, so they had to self-select to sunset their programs. One came back later once they were meeting those programs, and one never sought to be authorized again. As we looked at what trends did we see in those first 2 years? Across all the programs, both traditional and alternative, we saw a foundational need to deepen the content instruction and focus around scientifically based reading strategies for teacher candidates. We also were listening to our schools and our districts and the recent graduates of these programs, and we were hearing consistently from them that they wish they had deeper and more specific instruction around teaching early reading. In several of our programs, we were seeing right away that the primary text, resources, and the course content was contradictory to the standards that had been in place for years around scientifically based reading instruction. And what did that lead to? When they were teaching a little bit around the 5 components of reading, but they were still teaching things such as running records and the 3 cueing system. We consistently saw confusion from the teacher candidates and the recent graduates. They couldn't speak to most things around to teach reading. So teaching it all at once and not being focused was not coming to good outcomes. We also saw a huge trend that when scientifically based reading instruction was being taught to our candidates, it was being taught as, well, this is what you would do if a student needed intervention, not as tier 1 core instructional practices. So that was a big shift we had to see make. And in general, because of their confusion, they really couldn't even articulate scientifically based strategies. So we were really looking for that output data. If programs could claim they were teaching it, what was the result of that? So that's really where we had to shift our focus in the reauthorization visits to look at the outcome. As we transitioned into 21-22, as Shannon was saying, we had to think about supporting these things. So some of the things we saw right away after our first couple of years of these deep dives was that programs were starting to reach out to us, university programs, alternative programs, years in advance of their reauthorization to say, we're not sure we're meeting. Can we talk to you? What can we start looking at what we have in our courses? So they were starting to be proactive. We also had some strong examples, both in alternative and traditional programs that were meeting these standards deeply and consistently from the moment we came to visit them. So it was always nice to have those strong examples of where it was working well in the state. At the Colorado Department of Education level, we started doing a couple things. We deepened our reauthorization process in general to look at outcomes-based instead of inputs-based of what are you doing, but what impact is it having. We also hosted a reading symposium just for our preparation program leaders and faculty members to connect to national experts and colleagues across the nation so that they were hearing about the research and impact outside of just coming from the State Department level. After that, we also offered two things. We offered them, the faculty and leaders, free access to the professional development that we were giving our K-3 teachers across the state, and also free access to a community of practice where that was facilitated by two science of reading experts from Mount St. Joseph's University to really allow a space for faculty to talk to them as peers around course revisions that were happening widely across the state at that time. As we started looking at the next step of now, what did reauthorization start looking like? It's sort of in the last 2.5 years. We've had 5 university programs who were put on conditional reauthorization status because they were not meeting the standards and outcomes. We had 5 of them come off of that status. So they were on it for a year, had to revamp courses, and we came back and revisited again, and they were meeting standards. We had 2 alternative programs who were put on conditional reauthorization for 1 year and are in the process of still seeking to regain their status. And 1 alternative program that sunsetted, self-selected to sunset because they could not meet these standards. So that was in the last 2.5 years. I think one of the things that we wanted to share with you was what were some of our next steps and lessons learned at the State Department. First and foremost, we are continuing to do our deep dive in all of our reauthorization and authorization processes. I have to say that we will not be done with getting to every program until a year from now, in the fall of 2024. So one of the lessons learned is consideration of, although we were doing it in a high stakes process around the reauthorization of your program, should it have really taken 6 years to get done? So, you know, in hindsight, maybe we would have done it differently. Maybe we would have put more effort all into doing this, you know, in a more timely fashion. So that's one thing to consider. The second thing is we are making a commitment now to start looking at a deep dive around elementary math. So just wanted to mention that's sort of on the horizon for Colorado. And then 2 other things I think I would mention to my colleagues at state departments or state board members or legislators who are thinking about regulations to support these efforts is really that shared vision and focus from all those state leaders. You can't really get where we got, in my opinion, if we didn't have a singular shared vision and focus and support. So I think that's really important. And then the second thing I would say is you will have to address with our universities and colleges, especially the idea around academic freedom and where the accountability can lie for educator preparation programs to meet these standards. It's something we had to take on directly, that if you were seeking to be approved as a state approved preparation program to meet state licensure requirements, that academic freedom was in how you teach it, not what you teach. And so I just want to say that's something we had to address directly. Just some lessons learned in what we have learned over the last 5 years. So.
Great, thank you so much. That was just an incredible. In 55 minutes, we have given everybody a recipe book for how to catalyze and provoke policy change in your state. And I love the way we started this because we said, hey, you can pass policies, but it's really changes in practice that have to happen. And so I want to start, and please put your questions in the chat or put them in the Q&A because I'd rather ask your questions than mine. But I will start by asking Bella to reflect on you laid out pretty clear. You need a plan. You need to look at teacher training, instructional materials, monitoring, and so forth and so on. What do you see? And you cite some states that are doing it well. What do you see as the biggest obstacles to doing those kinds of things in the states that maybe just recently enacted policies and need to push the agenda forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think one sort of big obstacle is capacity. That sort of needs to be sort of the first thing. I mean, if a state passes they could pass a comprehensive, the best written policy that you could imagine. But if the state doesn't have the capacity to actually follow through on that, that is going to be a huge barrier.
So the people who are getting up every day who say, my job is to make this plan happen, and it's in the department, it's coaches, it might be in the regional authorities. Go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah. So all of that is sort of the overarching thing. And then I would say there's also sort of barriers at sort of the state and local level as well. There is pushback to sort of this approach. I think
change is hard. There's the natural
exactly.
inertia in education.
Exactly. And I think part of this is sort of a communication issue as well. I think when people talk about the science of reading, we tend to focus exclusively on sort of the phonics aspect. And we ignore this whole other component of like knowledge building. And that stuff is part of the science of reading, and it's equally as important. So I do think part of the barrier is also sort of how we message and we talk about the science of reading, because some people sort of see it as sort of drill and kill. It's boring. We don't want to teach it. So there's that as well.
Great. Colorado, Colleen or Mary, I love how you had separate columns for your early childhood education and your special education, because it's so easy to forget those categories of students. Say a little bit more. I mean, and maybe this is for you too, Bella. Are the things that are laid out by Future Ed, those different steps, are those pretty similar in those two spaces? What extra focus needs to happen for special ed students or for in the early childhood setting?
Thanks so much. We actually, again, looking for consistency, the standards are actually outlined in our elementary standards. And I know Shannon put a link in earlier to those. And then we just reference those in our early childhood and special ed generalists. We don't view them as being different. We view this as being the foundational knowledge that educators need to have, current and future, who are in these endorsement areas to understand emergent reading strategies for those, whether it's for intervention for special ed or tier 1 instruction in our, K-3 classrooms.
Great. I'm gonna use this to answer or propose Lee Keener's question. How does Colorado define kindergarten readiness, and how do you know if students are coming into the kindergarten setting ready to be successful?
Yeah, we focus obviously not only on, our physical well-being of our kindergartens, but that's where I think, and I can't remember if it was Christy, I think it could have been Christy or Shannon, talked a little bit about our assessments. And so we do have a standard group of assessments that we use to ensure that when all of our kinders come in, and we have intentionally picked a certain amount of them, and only those that we know are scientifically based reading research that will give us good, clear information, not only about readiness, but also about things like dyslexia, so that we can be ahead of that curve and ahead of the game. And so we have very intentionally set those markers to ensure that we adopted those programs and asked everyone to use those and incentivize that to make sure that they are indeed not only ready, but equitably ready across Colorado.
Excellent. Talk about, and maybe Bella, this is for you. What are those areas where schools and states are likely to get the biggest bang for the buck? Right, in terms of, a lot of times I think textbook selection might be because so much is in the classroom happens driven by the textbook, but maybe it's really more coaching for teachers, because if you don't change the practice, do you have a sense of that?
I might be the wrong person to ask for this because this might be a cop-out answer, but I really think it's a combination of all of them. I mean, we know from research that tutoring is super effective, but if the tutors aren't trained in the science of reading, and if what they're teaching is not aligned to the curriculum, it's not going to be as effective. So I really do think it's sort of a combination of all of these things, of the training and the materials, having the right textbooks, having the right intervention supports, the early identification. I really think it's a combination of all of it.
Great, great. Linda Darling-Hammond asks a very detailed question about really the kinds of research that's available to back up some of the strategies that are being used. Do you want to take a I think her bottom line is, how do you reconcile the fact that your definition of the research is at odds with the most rigorous research identified by the Institute for Education Sciences? I mean, are we really getting good research that can withstand scrutiny in terms of the approaches that we're taking? Anybody want to?
Is that for me?
I don't know. I'll leave it to anyone who wants to take it.
Sure. I think we need to continue to do more research. Obviously, that would be much helpful. But we selected the contrary practices in our study with the help of an expert panel that identified these practices as being lesser effective methods than other ones that we know to be true, or that instituted not as reliable assessments. In particular, is a lot of conversation, and the benefit is that it's caused a lot of just good conversation around things, and what do we mean by guided reading? A lot of people use the term guided reading, but they use the term but actually mean different things. So it's been a good conversation starter, as well as assessments, and what are really good assessments, and what is the purpose of each assessment. So I think it's opened a lot of doors to have really good conversation around what are the best methods and where do we need more research.
I want to get Larry's question is going to be the last one I address. Is really, what are the role of parents as teachers in this work? I think that's an easy one, but I'll let anybody who wants to take it go with it.
I'm happy to jump in just a little bit, and then would invite my colleagues around the room. What we found when we did the READ Act, right? So part of this work is also not just our educator preparation programs, but it's also our in-service teachers today. And we had a very specific initiative around elevating the parent role in helping our students reinforce, understand, number one, what scientifically based reading research and how to work with your students. And so we even partnered with our public broadcasting colleagues across the state to run reading courses on TV, online. You can sign up. And so we think that it's really critical that our parents understand what that difference is. We also equipped our teachers, our in-service teachers, through our READ Act training to help them understand literally how you take these tools and make them much easier for parents to understand, and then the kinds of tools that we give them. And so we doubled down on that a little bit, and even the statutory obligations that we had said, you will do a parent training, a guardian parent, adult in their life training program to help your students continue to support their learning and their reading. So I would say that goes hand in hand as well with everything else that we're doing, because we know that their very first teacher is their parent.
Excellent, excellent. And I think lots of parents know the message. Your child should be, reading every day. You should read with your child or have them read to you. There are a lot of strategies. But again, giving parents tips on what that actually looks like and how it can be most effective can be really important. And teachers can be a really primary source for that kind of information. All right, we are at 3:35. This is the point where we will now transition. For those of you who are state board members and want to stay on this conversation and continue it going forward. Please just don't do anything, stay on. Those who are not state board members, I invite you to leave the meeting. I thank you for joining us. I hope you had a lot of good key takeaways, and feel free to engage us via email or otherwise in continuing this dialogue, especially if you would like more information or want to join or support some of the work that NASB is doing. We have our upcoming annual conference, which will have a variety of presentations, some of which will speak to this issue of either early childhood education and early literacy. So thank you for joining and enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll